Number one, that's super dramatic, and I'm not trying to be dramatic. Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to part 2 of the new to me video where I talk about reading Stephen King for the first time. So if you haven't watched it already, I highly recommend going back and watching part 1 of this video. Part 1, I talk about the 5 books that I read by King. I go into detail about their storylines and my feelings about each book. I'm not going to do that in this video. I'm just going to mention the books by title and maybe some key points that help me illustrate for you my conclusions and my feelings about Stephen King, having read 5 books, having binged 5 Stephen King books. So I mentioned briefly in part 1 that Stephen King sort of feels like the author of my generation. And I mean that because his first book, Carrie, came out in the mid-70s, and I was born in 1980. And Stephen King is still writing books. For all of my 40 years, and even a few before, Stephen King has been writing books. Stephen King was very much a household name in the 80s, 90s. I mean, you knew who he was. And that's rare for an author. It's not inconceivable. But even not avid readers, we're talking my 10-year-old self or younger knew or understood that Stephen King was an author, that he wrote pretty scary stuff, and I knew what he looked like, and I was always a little bit afraid of Stephen King. I also grew up in a time where there was no YA, or nobody wrote young adult books for my generation when we were teenagers. We went from reading shit like Huckleberry Finn and the Hatchet and Where the Red Fern Grows and The Babysitter's Club to reading Stephen King. I mean, that was the leap that we made. And I can remember sitting in school as a 14, 15-year-old and seeing the boy next to me, his name was Mike, by the way, seeing the boy sitting next to me pulling out his Stephen King novel to read. But it wasn't rare. It wasn't odd. It was what it was. And he wasn't the only one. So many people were reading King. So many kids my age were reading King, which is one of the reasons that I'd never read any King, because I can be a tad bit rebellious and I don't want to do what everybody else is doing. So they went on to read Stephen King. I started picking up Dean Koontz. Let's be honest here. I am that person. So you never had to read a Stephen King book to know who Stephen King was. There were news stories about Stephen King. Stephen King's accident. The controversy over Stephen King and his feelings about the movie The Shining. He was newsworthy. How many authors today are newsworthy? And he's written books now for 40 plus years. And so he just felt like the author of my generation. So it was important to me to eventually read his books. It was kind of a shameful, unmentionable that I hadn't read his books yet. Every time I said that to somebody, or every time I said that on this channel, trust me, I felt a little twinge of shame. I felt a little bit like, how am I an avid reader born in the 80s and unfamiliar with Stephen King on an actual reading level? It was important to me to have accomplished reading King and to figure out if I needed to be reading King and to continue to read King. And should I now be following the career of Stephen King and picking up new releases, etc.? I think it's also worth noting that early in 2019, or probably mid-2019, I read a book by Joe Hill, who is Stephen King's son. And I DNF'd that book. I had assumed, based on what I'd heard, that I would like any book by Joe Hill. I was wrong. I bring that up because I also assumed that I would like Stephen King. And it's not that I don't. It's not that I don't like Stephen King, because there were two, well, there were three successful reading experiences for me out of the five books that I read. So I really liked Misery, Gerald's Game, and Elevation, and I really did not like, or was really disappointed in, Cujo and Firestarter. But the problems that I have, or one of the problems that I had with Stephen King, or that I found I had with Stephen King, was similar to a problem that I have with Joe Hill, which is unredeemable characters. It's sort of hard to explain, but I don't mind unlikable characters. However, in Stephen King novels, sometimes the characters aren't just unlikable, but they're definitely not redeemable. They're not good human beings. They're not anybody you'd ever want to know. And yet, in some books, like Firestarter, for example, Stephen King makes us spend a lot of time with these people and get to know them really well. Only they're terrible people and horrible human beings. And sometimes you don't want to think about the existence of people like that. And when you're reading King, it's hard to not acknowledge the existence of people like that. As such, sometimes it's a real downer. Sometimes it's kind of depressing to read intimate portraits of people that are not good. And sometimes intimate portraits of people that are actually downright vile human beings. I read 5 books. The man has like 60 some books. I read 5. And that was true, especially in Cujo and especially in Firestarter. Granted, those are both early works of King's, but I just have to imagine it just feels like something that's common in his writing. And part of the reason it feels like that is the second issue that I had while reading these books. King is very objective. Like, his authorial voice is kind of removed. And that's really evident when King is being crude or violent or gruesome. The way that he writes about those things is almost like medically sterile, like just super objective. I don't feel like King is ever bothered by the things that he writes about that are supposed to bother us. I'm not trying to make any statements of his about him personally, just as an author who could be any author. Everything sounds so normal. Some of the horrible things that I've read about in these 5 books, they're just talked about so casually. He's very casual in his crudeness and his, like, he can write some pretty awful things, and yet underneath it is this tone of factual, objective, casual, not affected kind of, I can't think of the word. I can't think of one good word that I'm trying to use. And to some people, I can imagine that being a good thing, a positive thing. People who maybe want this filter between them and something horrible. There's King. There's King who's like, okay, you know, who sounds very much like he's about to say, okay, we're not going to get excited about this, but let me tell you what happened. You know, it was a Tuesday and the world exploded. Like, but it was just a Tuesday and they were still serving coffee at the local diner. Like, what? You know, some people might need that veil, especially, you know, if they don't want to be creeped out, if they don't want to be disgusted, if they don't want to live that experience, they only want to hear about it. They probably really appreciate that writing style without even realizing that they are appreciating it, without even realizing that it's a thing. To me, though, it was very distracting. Very distracting. A child can kill someone, and it just, like I said, it's a Tuesday. It's just, it's whatever. Or, I don't want to give anything away. The language that some of his characters use, the ease at which they say some pretty horrible and despicable things. King's not holding anything back except himself, like his own opinions about things, his own, like there's not much. Maybe somebody who's read a lot of King can help me out here. Maybe somebody who knows literature better than I do can think of a word for this. I think that the ability to do this, the ability to take your own feelings about things based on what you choose to highlight and based on what you choose to censor. I mean, authors are unbeknownst to readers and themselves, putting themselves in books all the time, inserting themselves. There's an authorial voice that gives so much away about an author and their side of things and how they feel about things. And with King, there's just not a ton of that going on. I think the clearest bits of King that I got in these books was a little bit of social commentary and elevation, where the main character is coming to the aid of a lesbian couple in his town who are being treated unfairly. Or, something like Gerald's Game, where he highlights issues of consent, or even some other political stuff that he maybe slides in there. I mean, those feel like they're coming from a personal King place, but it's so odd to me. I just kept thinking, God, no big deal. Like something awful would happen. Awful. Absolutely awful. And it was just kind of like, meh. I kept thinking like, what? That's it? I kept needing to exercise certain emotion, and I just couldn't with these King novels. I couldn't. It was kind of like, this happened and we're moving on. I read books to exercise certain parts of myself that I don't act out in real life, like, or that I don't want to. Fear and rage and all of these things that Stephen King would be perfect for. Stephen King's books, theoretically, could be great tools for my emotional catharsis, yet they're not at all. So in that regard, I know now that I can't go to Stephen King for that. So what can I go to Stephen King for? Stephen King writes really interesting books, regardless of likability. I think Cujo is one of the most interesting books that I've read. I just didn't like it. King has a great imagination, where he writes the lives of so many people, and there's so much detail in his books and so much backstory in some of them, and you really get to know people and you really get a good idea of their motivations and why the things in the book are happening. There's no confusion. You don't sit around going, where did that come from? It's refreshing. You don't have to do any of the thinking in a Stephen King book. Do I like that or do I not like that? I don't know. But Stephen King actually lays it out for you and doesn't, there's nothing to figure out. His books are not mysteries. His books are really informative. His books are sometimes, in my opinion, like too informative. Like there's not, where there could be suspense, there maybe wasn't suspense. He's a great author, but there's a very specific style lane that I found in these 5 books that he lives in, and I'm not a huge fan of staying in that lane. Like, I will gladly visit that lane. I think, again, his books are super interesting, and his concepts, his detail, the stuff he can dream up is super interesting. And I think that, I'm only a better reader and a better person for having exposed myself to it. That said, stylistically, maybe not. I think I just need to be pretty careful. You know, Stephen King establishes tone and establishes story pretty early on. It's reliable. I don't think that you trudge through a really bland, boring beginning to get to a huge payoff. I think that the tone that's going to be the book is set pretty early on. If you're not feeling it, then you need to jump ship. And that's probably how I will approach King in the future. When I wasn't feeling Cujo, I probably should have quit reading it. When I wasn't feeling Firestarter, you guys, I almost DNF'd Firestarter at least 6 times. It was so difficult to get through. And I knew that, like, really early on. I knew, like, this isn't what I wanted. And I should have just hit the exit. I'm really interested in reading more of his non-horror titles because there was an emotional kind of connection between me and Elevation that didn't exist between me and the others. I connected psychologically to Gerald's game, and I was super excited about the Annie character in Misery. But as far as emotional impact, these books didn't have any, with the exception of maybe Elevation. So I'm thinking maybe I need to read other non-horror titles by Stephen King and see if that's more enjoyable for me. And then as far as his horror, like, just pay really close attention to concept and make sure that I'm really interested in the story that I think he's going to tell. And then also recognizing early enough whether or not a book is for me. I think I need to trust my instincts on that. But I think I'm doing myself a disservice if I slam the door on Stephen King. If I say, I'm never reading another Stephen King novel. Number one, that's super dramatic, and I'm not trying to be dramatic. Number two, I think as a reader and as an aspiring writer, like, I'm doing myself a disservice to not expose myself to his material on occasion and to, look at it as consuming different things sometimes and consuming authors of different calibers and authors with different styles. And Lord knows I don't want to read the same book over and over and over again. And I can say that if nothing else. Like, these were 5 extremely unique reading experiences. All 5 of these books. There was nothing that reminded me of other books. I didn't feel like I'd read it before. I didn't feel like the book was overdone. They were refreshing. They were unfamiliar. They were unique. Absolutely. And so I think if I can appreciate King for that, then as long as I'm feeling good about the first few chapters or first 100 pages or what have you of a King novel, then I can probably and should probably stick with it. But if something turns me off pretty early, I'm just going to have to acknowledge that. Overall, super worthwhile experience. I'm super grateful to my colleague Jackie for putting this project in motion. I can't explain to you the sense of accomplishment I feel at having gone from 0 King novels read to a month later 5 King novels, 4.5 read. I feel like I accomplished something. I don't feel like anything was a waste of time, even the books that I didn't like. So I'm just glad that I made myself do this. And hopefully in the process, through my own experience, through my own learning process, I've helped you better understand how you feel about King, or how you could potentially feel about King if you haven't read his books yet either. Let me know that. Am I talking to diehard King fans, or am I talking to people who are, completely unfamiliar with his work? I'm interested because it took me so long to read my first. But if you have King novels in mind that you think that I would really enjoy after hearing everything that I had to say, then leave those for me down in the comment section below. Or if you just want to talk about King a little bit more, if you want to tell me about books I definitely need to stay away from, I'm interested in all that info. But thank you so much for watching this two-part series. It was just going to be way too long for one video. I appreciate it. I will see you guys very soon.